Trust the science. That's what former President Joe Biden told the American people. But did he? A new bombshell report reveals he ignored 3 of the 4 medical experts he sought counsel from in 2021 when COVID policy was crafted. While his handpicked team concluded that a prior COVID-19 infection should qualify as one of the 2 doses of the mRNA vaccine, Biden's administration disagreed.
The administration's federal mandate impacted millions of people, many of whom lost their jobs for not adhering to that policy. Here to elaborate on her reporting is Emily Kopp, investigative reporter with the Daily Caller News Foundation. Welcome, Emily.
Good morning.
So I just want to start off with what we alluded to in the introduction there, because my own feeling is anytime COVID comes up, it's very easy for things to get sort of overly generalized. So correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand your story, it's about this board or panel of 4 scientists who were brought together by the Biden administration in late 2021. At issue was a mandate for the federal workforce, but the disagreement really was whether prior infection should count as equivalent to one of the 2 mRNA shots, correct?
Yeah, so let's dig into the specifics. So I wrote this story to highlight a chapter in pandemic history that I don't think millions of people are aware of. It involves this 30-minute Zoom meeting that shaped the livelihoods of millions of Americans. The Biden administration was implementing these OSHA emergency temporary standards, vaccine mandates, in other words, that applied to large private employers, federal agencies and contractors, health providers accepting Medicare and Medicaid funding. And these vaccine mandates were mimicked by many large county and municipal governments as well. And so altogether, these policies affected more than 100 million Americans. So in October 2021, top Biden health officials, including former CDC Director Rochelle Walensky and Chief Scientific Advisor Anthony Fauci, privately met with 4 immunology and vaccinology experts. These experts are familiar to many of us because they were in the press a lot during the height of the pandemic. Paul Offit, Michael Osterholm, Peter Hotez, and Akiko Iwasaki. The administration posed a question to these experts: should prior immunity be counted when implementing vaccine mandates? Should people who have recovered from a prior infection be exempted from the requirement to get vaccinated or lose their jobs? News of this meeting has trickled out in bits and pieces over the years, thanks largely to the Epoch Times, which obtained information about it via FOIA. What hasn't been previously reported is that the majority of these scientific experts handpicked indeed prior immunity should be credited under the vaccine mandates. There was a 3-1 split in favor of prior infection counting in some capacity. And what you touched upon is that 2 of the experts said that while hybrid immunity is best, an infection should be treated as equivalent to 1 dose of the 2-dose mRNA regimen. So that's absolutely correct. The Biden administration apparently overruled this advice and required that even individuals with a prior infection receive both doses. One of the experts present at the October meeting told me that he thought it was simply because it was simpler logistically that way. But when asked about this policy in the media and when pressed by congressional Republicans at the time, that's not what Walensky and Fauci said. They didn't talk about logistical issues. They talked about hybrid immunity being preferred while sidestepping the question of whether prior immunity alone or prior immunity in a single shot might be sufficient for many Americans.
But sorry, just because I do think these
instance.
specifics are important, Emily. Just sorry to cut across you, but of the 4 people, as I read your piece, none of them were arguing that prior immunity would be equivalent to the benefits of receiving both shots of the vaccine. It was whether, to use your word, it would be credited as 1 shot of the 2 required, no?
So Paul Offit, who is among the best recognized vaccinologists in the world, has argued and continues to argue that prior infection gives you durable long-term immunity against severe disease, and that prior immunity would be sufficient. And in fact, I talked to him back in 2020 when the clinical trials were going on. And I remember him saying that very good vaccines will give you equivalent protection as a prior infection. Very good vaccines will give you equivalent protection as a natural immunity. But that was the goal, right? And since that time, we've seen a variety of studies and some conflicting conclusions whether prior immunity is superior or the two-dose vaccine regimen is superior. Hybrid immunity is generally recognized to be the best. But I think the science clearly was not as black and white as many people who were affected by the vaccine mandates were led to believe.
One of the things that concerned me in your report as well is you mentioned that this meeting only lasted for 30 minutes. This was a sweeping federal policy that, as you mentioned, impacted millions of people within the federal bureaucracy and even more outside of it. It's kind of stunning to me that it only took them 30 minutes of advice from these scientific officials to then ignore everything they said and go forward with a 2-shot mandate anyway.
Yeah, it is sort of remarkable because I think typically with major decisions regarding medical countermeasures that are being taken by millions of people, you would convene an FDA advisory group, this advisory group called the VRBPAC, which did provide input on a lot of the decisions around the COVID vaccines. They didn't do that in this case. They talked to 4 experts privately. We only know about this meeting because Offit talked about it on a podcast and because there was a FOIA request by the Epoch Times that unveiled some details, including the detail that it was only scheduled for 30 minutes. So that's a major contrast to what we typically expect with big decisions like this, where outside experts would have a public meeting and where the public would, have the opportunity to give their input as well. And I think it was important to revisit this chapter in pandemic history that a lot of people aren't aware of because, of course, there's been a lot of discussion of late about the power of the executive branch via DOGE to lay off federal workers. And there's been a lot of media attention, on DOGE's efforts to reduce the size of government and, in some cases, shutter entire federal agencies. And I think reasonable people can debate about whether those layoffs are capricious or extra legal. But both Democrats and Republicans agree that the mission of DOGE to reduce fraud, waste, and abuse in government is a worthy one. And I think it's interesting to look back at this pretty recent history and remember this episode during which the executive branch was effectively executing the layoffs, not just of federal bureaucrats, but of a lot of frontline health professionals and military service members. And unlike with DOGE, it's not clear that the mission was entirely a worthy one. In many cases, people were fired who already had immunity from severe disease, if you believe Paul Offit.
But Emily, I think this is why the one-shot issue becomes more important, because if you're extrapolating from this the argument about laying people off because they refused to get vaccinated and had some principled objection or some concern about that. The difference of opinion that you are drawing attention to would only differentiate between people who got 1 shot and that was sufficient as opposed to people who got 2 shots. If you had an objection to getting vaccinated at all, the distinction is moot, surely, because they're still saying get 1 shot.
I think it's totally fair to point out that distinction. One thing that Anthony Fauci said that I totally agree with is that we need to conduct sociological studies to better understand vaccine hesitancy and how these mandates might have affected vaccine hesitancy. Would a more nuanced approach where, okay, you only have to get 1 shot of the 2-dose mRNA regimen, would that have instigated as much backlash as the more simplistic message favored by Walensky and Fauci did? I think it's an open question and I think it should be studied. I think one major reason that I wanted to write this story is that people who are familiar with the history of Paul Offit and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. know that these men are arch rivals. At one point, Kennedy said that Offit belonged in jail. But I think it's interesting that even people at bitter loggerheads about vaccine policy and public policy both agree that there were opaque decisions made during the pandemic that were not entirely science driven, that were driven by having a simplistic public health message that have led to our current culture of there being a lot of mistrust. And I think the scientific community, given that people with entirely different worldviews both agree on that point, needs to have a vigorous debate about how the public health establishment makes up for lost ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think the broader point that you're getting at here, Emily, is the idea that if people were properly communicated that natural immunity does have some significance when it comes to prevention from serious infection, perhaps they wouldn't have had as much widespread vaccine hesitancy because they would have felt like they weren't being taken for a ride by public health officials. And I have to say, you know, taking Niall's point from the opposite side of the political spectrum, I was a bit I felt like some of the scientists in this meeting, it seemed like, didn't go far enough into accepting the significance of prior infection in terms of natural immunity, which has been well established in the time since this meeting happened. And I wanted to bring up another article that you wrote recently about this new Yale study about what's called post-vaccine syndrome, where people have developed chronic conditions like brain fog, muscle aches, and excessive fatigue. There were legitimate reasons for people to be hesitant or skeptical about the COVID-19 vaccines that I feel like weren't properly appreciated by public health officials at the time, which drove a lot of these federal employees to feel like they had to resign or be forcibly fired rather than go ahead with this two-shot regimen.
Yeah, and the lead author of that paper is actually one of the scientists who was present at this October Zoom meeting, October 2021 Zoom meeting, Akiko Iwasaki. And she writes that for some people, we don't know how many people, but they struggle to clear the spike protein after a vaccine, and it causes long-term inflammation in a way that mimics long COVID. So, you know, without mandates, would more people have long COVID? With mandates, do more people have this post-vaccine syndrome? I think scientists should have those discussions, and I think there should be more studies. One of the things that Iwasaki's co-authors mentioned is that they could only do a very small scale study because it's very difficult to get NIH funding to broach these really taboo questions. So I think we have a lot more to learn about what went wrong with COVID, but I think we shouldn't be afraid to ask the questions.
Sure. Thanks. Emily Kopp, Daily Caller News Foundation. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. All right, up next, a former Trump official will discuss the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. Stick around.